Every coach I have ever had has learned by their coach, who's learned by their coach, who's learned by their coach. There's no sports science, there's no anatomy, physiology. We're doing crazy batshit stuff we shouldn't be doing. We need to change this. Say you're fighting at 66 kilos, but you're walking around at, say, 88 kilos, you're 22 kilos out, which I've seen, and all your S&C, your preparations at 88 kilos. When you actually cut, you're not getting the same benefits or size advantage that your coach thinks he's giving you. This still happens, right? And this is batshit scary. After that paper that said things were anaerobic, I actually seen coaches of kids run around the gym holding their breath. He failed 95% of the movement assessment. He couldn't squat properly, he had no stability in his legs, he couldn't, he had no overhand reach. And I was thinking, why are you deadlifting and doing Olympic lifts if you can't even stand on one leg? We need to find what's limiting performance. We know what makes performance good and the attributes that we want to put in the ingredient mix, but we need to work out what's maybe not working. And it was kind of ironic, right? Because we've done all this breathing work with Billy beforehand. A few weeks being like, relax your breathing, because he was getting conscious that maybe he wasn't breathing right. So we done all this breathing work, exhalation, sharp exhalation, get CO2 out, get nice kind of shallow breathing, get everything on that. And it just went right out the window. Because suddenly we're in an environment where the temperature was so high, heart rate was elevating at crazy rates, lactate was through the roof, and he just was really struggling to breathe. We're interested in making our athletes the best they can be, but also putting them in a position where we know they're in the ring, they're fueled, they're hydrated, and they're in the best position to defend themselves as well.
Welcome to this new episode. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsor for the podcast, Moxy Monitor. If you've been following my work, you know that the Moxy is a tool that I use a lot for testing, but also for everyday training and coaching. For those who don't know about the Moxy Monitor yet, it's a NIRS device that measures muscle oxygen saturation and blood volume in real time. It's a non-invasive sensor that is placed on the skin and can be worn during any training or sporting activity. Motocross riders and climbers wear it on their forearms. Hockey players on the ice, swimmers can wear it in water. I've used it to test rugby players, CrossFit athletes, endurance athletes, and more. The Moxy allows you to individualize work and rest periods, optimize load, reps and sets, identify training thresholds in real time, and even correct movement based on what the data shows you. You can also use the Moxy Monitor to determine an athlete's energetic limiting factor and their individual training zones. Using this process, I can now target the athlete's limiter with precision in order to improve their performance without adding unnecessary volume to their program. You can view and collect the data on your Garmin watch and can also pair the Moxy with other physiological testing products such as the VO2 Master, Pnoe, and Cosmed VO2 systems. The Moxy is a product I've been using for many months with great success, and I highly recommend it to any coach who's interested in digging a little bit deeper on the physiological side of health, fitness, or performance. You can use the coupon UPSIDE at checkout for a 5% discount on moxymonitor.com/shop. That's UPSIDE, UPSIDE, for a 5% discount. With that said, let's get into the show. All right, Andrew, we're on the podcast. How you doing, man?
Doing very, very well. Thank you very much.
How did you first get into fighting?
Okay, so that's kind of interesting. So I'm from Glasgow, the east end of Glasgow. So I grew up in the 70s, and back in the 70s, it was pretty rough. We lived in quite a deprived area. So my old man was like, you need to take up a serious sport that you can handle yourself with. So it was karate, which was probably the worst one to choose. So about 5 years old, I started karate, and then that wasn't panning out too well. So I did boxing. So around about, I think 7 or 8, I started amateur boxing. And then when I was about 16, I met this girl at college, and she was French, and her brother did Savate boxe française, kickboxing. So I kind of get really intrigued by that because it was a little bit more brutal than what we were doing. So I started to play around with that. And then before I knew it, I was fighting Muay Thai overseas. And things were going really, really well until I took a really bad blow to the elbow, from the elbow to the upper part of my head. And I got, what we call a Pott's Puffy tumor. So I got an infection in the bone. And basically, that was kind of the end of my fighting career, technically.
How old were you then?
I'd have been just about to turn 18, so about 17 and a half, 18.
So
But
you fought overseas when you were really young.
Yeah. So, and that was kind of interesting because in my naivety, I just thought, oh, I'll get this surgery, everything will be okay, and I'll continue kickboxing, and then I'll come get my pro boxing license. And any proper sanctioning body would not allow me to box But there's a lot of unsanctioned bodies that would allow me to box. And when you're young, you're really stupid. So I kind of boxed a little bit, and then I realized that it just wasn't going to happen. So I kind of moved into coaching in my 20s. And then I met my wife at 25.
What was your first step? What was your first step into coaching? How did you start that?
I think it's an interesting story. I don't know if I should go into that either. So basically, I was in the gym doing Thai boxing, and the Thai boxing coach one day never turned up for some reason. And basically, it was suggested that I should take the class. And so that was it. I was kind of thrown in the deep end, and I basically took the class. And I wouldn't say I really loved it because I wanted to train, but it basically meant I didn't have to pay my fees. So it was kind of a win-win situation. So I started coaching, and then started coaching a lot of kids classes, and just basically became like, you know, the gopher in the gym, you know, kind of unscrupulous coach, paint walls, go for KFC, go for Dunkin' Donuts. So again, the gopher. So that was it. But then when I met my wife, she had just finished her GP training. So she's a doctor. So she wanted to go to the Highlands, and she had this whole idea of, you know, rural healthcare, seeing patients from birth to death and all that good stuff. So we went to the Highlands, and I soon discovered there was nowhere to train. There was no boxing gyms. There was no kickboxing gyms. There was absolutely nothing. It was like bleak. So I thought, well, if I'm going to compete again or train, or I'm going to have to set up a club. So that's kind of how I fell into it more full time than anything else. And then in my 30s, getting to MMA, I was in a lot of seminars, and I just started to look around about me, and I thought, you know what? Every coach I have ever had has learned by their coach, who's learned by their coach, who's learned by their coach. There's no sports science. There's no anatomy, physiology. We're doing crazy batshit stuff we shouldn't be doing. We need to change this. So at that point, I thought, let's do a bit more sports science. So I kind of at that point started in a lot of postgrad education, sports therapy, biomechanics. And then 15 years later, I'm still kind of busy doing crazy rabbit hole stuff. And that was it. And I guess it's all I've ever done, really, in a lot of ways. Is I've tried other sports. I mean, I did play soccer for quite a while, and was pretty good as a kid. But it's just something visceral about punching someone else in the face. Yeah, it's probably a Glasgow thing, I think. But I've been very, very lucky though. It's been a good career.
You said if you had to pick a sport today for a kid to be able to handle himself, as you said, what would be the choice, the sport of choice today?
Boxing.
Yeah, stick with boxing.
Definitely boxing. Yeah, if I had to choose two, it'd be boxing and then probably Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
Okay. Yeah.
But definitely boxing. I think boxing. I mean, I've been very lucky. I've worked a lot with special forces. I've done a lot with the police, and we always default back to basically distance awareness, time and spatial awareness, and striking. So it always kind of falls back to that for me. So I think boxing is a good sport.
Coming from boxing and kickboxing and Muay Thai, what was your first outlook on MMA when I guess it first started getting popular on the global scene?
I was quite excited about it. I've always been interested in performance, and the thing that kind of took me away from karate and taekwondo and those sports, I mean, I had done them for a lot of years, was that kind of there was no real test of performance. You know, there was full contact competitions, but there was certain rules and regulations to it. And, you know, having fought kind of Muay Thai and been beaten up by several people all my life, because I was never that great, I kind of knew the importance of practical performance and ability to do the sport. So when MMA started coming to the scene, it was quite exciting and interesting to me, combining it, because we were kind of more or less going down that route in my gym anyway. We had wrestlers would come and visit from overseas, and they would clinch you and throw you around. You'd be like, well, why is that happening? And then we had quite a lot of like judo practitioners. So we were kind of doing it, but not a really formalized structure. And it would have been I'd have been quite late into it because I'm a bit of a dinosaur. So at 35, we had a straight blast gym. So we had affiliated in with the straight blast gym. So we were one of the few, in that time actually, in the Highlands, we would have been the only gym actually doing MMA training at that particular time. And the reason I kind of fell back to boxing was, A, I was not very good at MMA. And B, for whatever reason, I just have an innate love of boxing. I just think it's very pure. If you remove the politics, it's a very pure sport, you know, and I think it's much more evenly matched to some extent. So that's kind of why I went back to it after all these years.
If we talk about boxing now, I like to talk about the demands of a given sport. So from your perspective and everything you've learned through the years, or maybe we can talk about the evolution of that perspective from your standpoint. When you started fighting, what were, in your eyes, the demands of the sport, and how do you look at them now?
So the demands, well, there was no understanding of the demands of sport when I was a kid. I mean, basically you turned up, you did your training sessions, there was no rhyme or reason to it. It's just you came in, and boxing gyms are still like this. You go in, there's a beeper on, you hit 3 minutes in one bag, beep, you don't go to the next station, you hit that bag. And there was no rhyme or reason to it. And it's still the same, actually, in a lot of amateur gyms today. And when I think back on it, I think, wow, you know, it's like a trial of fire, because you go in as a young amateur and you basically hit the bag, and you're lucky if a coach takes you aside and puts you on the focus pads and goes, right, come on, let's work some technique. And you kind of go through that process, and then eventually you kind of do some competitions, you do a couple of amateur fights, and your coach spends a bit more time with you, and then it progressively builds up. But during that phase, there's no discussion of performance, S&C, nutrition, you're cutting weight by yourself. I mean, it's hard to believe when I think back now. For all of my life, up until the age of 25, I weighed 8 stone 7 on the dial.
What's that in either kilos or pounds for those who don't speak
I knew
stones?
You were going to ask this. I thought, oh no, Lord.
Yeah, I have no clue what a stone is.
I'm going to have to look at that. So I now know the metric system slightly better. I'd have been, what, 8 stone 7. About 52 kilos. Okay. All in all, I think. So I was 52 kilos. And I never actually went out of weight. I was always in weight. And nobody ever taught me how to weight cut. I just was naturally at that weight. So I sat around 52, 53 kilos all the time. So it was pretty okay for me. But I used to see kids suffer, like really badly suffer. You know, a week before a fight, cutting 7 and 8 kilos. You know,
I guess it depends on the weight class now, but take an average boxer, let's say, I don't know, 60 kilos, 70 kilos. How many kilos above their weight class are they going to be training at usually before they start cutting for a competition?
That depends. So for example, we've got 2 boxers just now going for title. So we get Billy, who's like a super bantamweight. So he's going for the IBF youth in a couple of weeks' time. So Billy will fight at 55.3 and he's only about 1.8 kilos out just now.
Okay.
So he's pretty close, and we'll get 4 weeks more or less. Dean Sutherland's going for WBO super youth one, and he is about 5 kilos out. So he'll compete around about 67 kilos at welterweight. So we don't like our fighters going too extreme out. So I like myself personally about 10-12% over the weight limit to be out of camp. So we're quite diligent in that, just because I kind of feel from my own experience and all the research that if you are saying, say you're fighting at 66 kilos, but you're walking around at say 88 kilos, you're 22 kilos out, which I've seen, and all your S&C and your preparations at 88 kilos, when you actually cut, you're not getting the same benefits of size advantage that your coach thinks he's giving you, because you're dehydrated, you're depleted, you know, your substrates all over the place, you're not getting any performance gains. But people still want this size advantage. And this has been something I've been trying to really push heavily in boxing for the last few years, is that it's a false concept to a certain extent. It's only valuable if your athlete's able to train at that weight, dehydrate and hydrate back up and get the benefits of it.
How long is there between weigh-in and the fight?
It depends on the tournament. Some days it's the day before. Others, like amateurs, sometimes can be on the day weigh-ins, and there can be multiple fights for amateurs. It just depends. We don't dehydrate. So a lot do water loading and crazy, like, you know, start off with 20 gallons of water and cut it down. I don't do any of that stuff in our boxers. We basically have a slightly longer camp, so we can tail them down. But then our boxers are not that far out, so we don't really have that that problem. You know, you can take easily 6 kilos off a boxer in a week in dehydration strategies if you want. I just argue that from a performance point of view is maybe not the best way.
It's interesting that you mentioned that from a performance standpoint. I've heard, I am not well versed in that realm, so bear with me, but I've also heard potential links between or the negative impact of dehydration on concussions. Yes. Is that something that you're aware of, or that you take into account, or that is it valid in your perspective?
Yeah, because if you think about it, you know, when you dehydrate, you're kind of removing all the fluid around about the kind of the brain, so the brain's more susceptible to shock, and you're going to get more instances of head trauma. One of the reasons I started getting quite heavily into research for boxing was I I kind of wanted to look at what's our current understanding of boxing physiology versus when this research first started occurring, which was about 25 years ago, and there's not a lot. There's a lot of research looking at CTE and kind of the effects of brain trauma, but there's not a lot of research actually looking at underlying physiological principles or what's taking place. So that's kind of important. We kind of get a really good kind of handle on that, because the more we can understand about the physiology, the more we can inform boxing training and coaches, and the more we can prevent these dehydration and water loading strategies, and we can prevent subcutaneous hematomas or brain injuries or bleeds or anything like that, because we really shouldn't be seeing those type of things anymore, I don't think. But you have to also remember that boxing is a sport that, from a coaching perspective, is a massive difference in standards of education and experience. You know, you've got some coaches that will get massive amount of experience, very open to sports science, really embrace it. And you get some that are very old school, that don't really have any interest in it. And there's a mix of opinion. Some people think a talented kid will be a world champion. Other people believe that you can nurture talent and you can bring it out and you can take an athlete to world level.
What do you think?
So, I think it's a bit of both. I think you need some talent. I think, but what I will say is we've had people train with us that probably came in not the most gifted naturally, if you want to use that term, but through hard work and sports science, proper nutrition, S&C, have went on to do exceptionally well at world level. So I think it depends. I think sometimes when you see a boxer and they come to you and you're being told, oh, they're a waste of time, a lot of times it's because there's been no investment in them. There's been no understanding. How does your body move? Is it function the way it should? What can we do to fix it? What's your substrate utilization like? Can we kind of play around with this? And overall, kind of what's your biomechanics, your efficiency level, your striking ability, your tactical, technical prep? So
you had all this practical experience with boxing and fighting experience yourself. What were the first pieces of the physiology of boxing that you started to maybe look at or get interested in?
So probably the first thing for me was biomechanics. You know, you watch a lot of fights, you see as obviously a fighter fatigues, gross motor skills and fine motor skills start to drop off at certain points, and you start to see them lunge and haymaker and everything else. Whereas you see successful boxers have really good composure, good structure, good balance. So the first thing that interested me was biomechanics. And then when we started looking at hand speed and maintaining hand speed and velocity, and then we started thinking, well, what contributes to that? And that then went into substrate utilization. And the last 3-4 years, I've been quite fascinated by what's their body actually doing in the lab versus actually in the ring, because it's two different things. I mean, it's completely chalk and cheese. And so my whole big thing now is being, is VO2 max relevant to boxer? Is lactate threshold and lactate testing relevant to boxer? And or should we be looking at more modern conventional models of bioenergetics to see what is this individual doing? What's their fat carb utilization like? What's the recovery between rounds like? What's their ability to tolerate temperature and inflammation and impact? And that's kind of the big rabbit hole that we kind of went down. It's massive. It's a massive rabbit hole.
We'll definitely go into it. Did you have what was your, or let's say, did you get to learn and know let's say the old model of bioenergetics? I mean, I think Joel Jameson, you know, type of thing, which is a fantastic book, by the way. For those who haven't read it, go read the book. And I think there's a lot of great things to still take from that book, even if maybe some of the underlying physiology principles might not be accurate today, but who knows? Maybe, you know, what we think is accurate now is probably not accurate anyway. So But did you get into that side of things, into the anaerobic, alactic, anaerobic, lactic, and aerobic? Did you get into that with the boxing, or did you bypass that some way?
So this is kind of interesting because for my master's, I'm kind of writing a paper on boxing physiology. So, and I'm going to do this in a presentation, so I'll cover some of it. So back about 25 years ago, in 1995, I was this is when I was kind of moving more into coaching. I realized that I kind of enjoyed it, kind of didn't, but I was going to stick with it. I was at a conference, and 95 was the first time a paper had really been produced on boxing physiology by Ghosh over in India. And he was using heart rate and lactate to measure kind of aerobic and anaerobic contributions. And I remember sitting to that presentation, and out of nowhere, I can't remember who was doing the presentation, but they brought up this mystical figure that boxing was 80% anaerobic and 20% aerobic from this paper. And that was the first time I thought, that doesn't seem right.
What didn't sound right to you in that statement?
Even back then, my original degree was computer science and engineering before I'd started doing postgrad sports science. But even back then, thinking of thermodynamics and thinking of just systems in general, I thought that seems a really specific percentage. Out of 25 kind of Indian national level boxers or whatever it was. I thought that's really, really bizarre. And it seemed to me, having thought, that it's highly intermittent. You have moments where you can be really in the pocket and everything's flying. You have moments where you're basically gassing and you're crawling around the edge of the ring, staying away from your opponent. Or you have moments where you're just leaning heavy. And to me, it just seemed that perhaps that wasn't a true representation of what was taking place. But at 23, there was no other research, so you're kind of stuck in this bubble. But a funny story about this is this paper, this Gosh paper, and I apologize to Gosh et al., has been the bugbear of my life because, and this still happens, right? And this is batshit scary. After that paper that said things were anaerobic, I actually seen coaches have kids run around the gym holding their breath. And I remember sitting thinking, what the hell is going on here? And I said to a particular coach, I'm not going to name them or shame them, but I said, what are you doing? They're like, oh, well, we need to train anaerobically. And I remember just thinking, wow, this is a bad sign. And I've been to boxing courses at national level, and there's still been some quite spurious comments in regard to aerobic and anaerobic training methods. And it all came off of this one paper. And you know what it's like? So people read the one paper, but don't read the next 25 years.
Yeah.
The paper.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is looking through the years, we are still boxing right up into probably a couple of years ago, still very obsessed by the aerobic contribution and the anaerobic contribution. And they're still looking at VO2 max on a treadmill versus lactate threshold. So there's been a few people are doing what I'm looking to do, which is wear like a portable unit to measure gas exchange, but they're still using very simulated methods. It's still not a true reflection. But out of those 25 years, there's only like 4 or 5 papers actually looked at that. Everyone else is still VO2 max on a treadmill. Let's have a look at glycolysis through lactate readings on the treadmill, or through sparring, take some lactate readings. And so it's still a very old model of energetics. There's not a lot of people really want to go in the rabbit hole saying, well, look.
How applicable is the running to a boxer?
It's not very applicable.
For me, you think boxing, you think road work. So how important is that? And then what's the distinction between that and what you would see in a VO2 max test?
So running historically has been used for weight loss. That's really been the main driving factor behind it, put the hours in. But running with poor running technique and poor gait obviously can have a higher propensity for injuries. So if you look at the energetics of the sport, especially amateur, and you think 3 rounds, 3 minutes, it's all out, it's ferocious. How relevant is a 20k run to that? It's not particularly relevant. A VO2 max test, how relevant is that? Well, it's obviously a graded exercise test, so we're going through increments in different kind of speed levels, but it's not, again, reflective because boxing is highly intermittent. So it's moments of activity and moments of none.
And
so I don't think it's relevant.
The upper body contribution too, that changes the game completely from just a running sport.
Yeah, I mean, in the last 25 years, I think there's been a massive difference in VO2 scores. So it's ranged from like 45 up to about 67, I think, which is run about, I don't have the paper handy, but I should, but around about 67. Now that VO2 max in the high 60s was recorded on a bike, not a treadmill. So if you think about that, you think boxing is showing maybe like 47 is a VO2 max score. You think about an endurance runner or a cyclist, that's a pretty poor VO2 max in relation. Even the top scores are not that great. So at this point, you have to think to yourself, well, how relevant really is that to the sport? And I've argued for quite some time that it's not relevant. I understand in the laboratory, we're looking to reproduce certain factors, so it makes sense to do the test. But my PhD was looking to kind of really change that dynamic a little bit and suggest that perhaps this is not the model that we're looking for. So it's time to move.
You made my job easy here. Perfect segue. Let's talk about your PhD. What are you looking to investigate? Or maybe to finish on what you were talking about before, talk a little bit more about your master's and what you found through that work and what you're looking to put out, and then
Yeah.
let's go into your future research projects.
So at the moment, I'm finishing my research master's at Roehampton. So I was very lucky that a few years ago, I hooked up with David McAllister. David McAllister, the McAllister family is like boxing royalty in Scotland. They've been there, they've done it all, they've got a gym. And when I met David, he was very keen to kind of get me up to the gym to do some sports science. And David's a bit younger than me, so he's only hit his 40, so he's a bairn, he's a youngster. But he's very proactive on making sure boxers get good wellness, good health, and longevity. So for them, it's about doing the right thing with boxers. So that was a good meeting for me, because effectively I shut my gym to go there. So I thought, well, this is where I want to be. And through that, it opened up an opportunity to have access to very high level athletes for research, which is one of the biggest challenges.
Mm-hmm.
So it came at a really good time with David in the Northern Sporting Club, which meant doing the masters, we could start to look at boxing physiology and start to try and get a different view in it. Now, COVID kind of didn't help, because we had this massive plan set up to the research, which we couldn't do. So we've ended up doing review papers and putting, so basically what happened is we ended up doing, I've spent the last 6 months, last 25 years of research in boxing. I think I've read every single paper there is, and putting together a comprehensive review paper on what do we know, what don't we know. And that's kind of worked out quite favorably, because I wanted to do a PhD, which was going to look at systemic and localized substrate utilization. So I wanted to look at the respiratory, cardiopulmonary, and I wanted to also look at what's happening at the muscle level. And the problem we had was that all the universities I kind of approached were kind of like, yeah, it sounds pretty cool, but we don't have any experts in boxing to do that with, because you're the only person doing it. And then ironically, it turned out the one university that was super keen is like 25 minutes down the road, to Abertay University. And PhD supervisor there, Dr. John Babbage, is, I'm going to call him eccentric, so I hope he doesn't take offense at that. But he has got such an insight into combat sports, because it's a big area of interest of his. And he's just a complete wizard with sports science. And he was like, yeah, let's do this. So the PhD is going to be taking that original provisional work on understanding physiology, and we're going to go deep dive. We're going to be looking at the difference between the bike, the treadmill, pads, bag sessions, sparring sessions. Sparring, we're going to use Moxy sensors. We'll probably get to that. And we're going to try and put some new models together, looking at rates of fatigue and how they occur, and how biomechanics can potentially affect substrate utilization. So I'm very excited about this. So it's a chance to look at very high level pro boxers, because there's no research on pro boxers. It's all amateurs. I mean, it is a different sport. So it's going to be really, really exciting. And that's obviously at Abertay University. So they're the ones that are mad enough to let me do it. So, so it's going to be good. It's going to be really good.
From the review you've done, you said you read pretty much all the boxing papers that have come out. Yeah. What were maybe some of the eye-opening moments, some of the things you, maybe aha moments that you had, things you didn't know and that you discovered and that clicked with the experience that you had previously in the sport?
I think, I'm trying to think if there's any like aha moments. I think probably the biochemistry, we're still, I think probably what I took from it was more what we still needed to do rather than what's been discovered, because really there's not been a lot being discovered, other than we know what a VO2 is and we know really what a lactate reading should be. I mean, that's as exciting as it's got. But there has been some interesting things from the strength and conditioning side of it, discussing, the phases of boxing, because for a long time, a lot of us have advocated that, power comes from the ground up, and that we have to train the legs in boxers more than we probably need to train the deltoid. And that's something that's come through a lot of the research paper. Latinsky's done a nice paper looking at EMG muscle activation, and they've shown basically that the deltoid is the last to activate, which is something we've seen in Moxy, quite a while ago. So that's been interesting. But from the physiological side of it, it's been more the things we're not looking at. We're not looking at adrenaline, cortisol levels to see how that affects substrate utilization. It's not really been a lot of papers on that. The papers are predominantly being focused on weight cutting and the risks of crash weight cutting, and trying to identify aerobic and anaerobic contribution. But there's been very few people who have sat and thought, well, we now know that all these energy systems are at play, just depend on the intensity level and contribution level. So we know that. So let's look at the split of fats and carbs between rounds. And there's not a lot of papers looking at things like rates, rest and recovery between rounds, which is crucial. And the other one that's not been looked at, I'm giving away my PhD here, and there'll be some 25-year-old trying to steal it. The other one they haven't looked at is environmental factors, like heat under lighting conditions. How does that change performance metrics? So it's been more a case of what haven't we looked at, which has been good, because the worst case scenario is you go through the research, you go, damn it, it's been done and it's going to be better than mine. So it's been quite positive in the sense it's been the opposite. It's been like, oh wow, we still haven't locked in any of this.
What are some of the leading hypotheses for you going into that work that you'd like to test and see how it pans out?
I'm curious to see what the difference is biomechanically between upper and lower body and contribution to localized oxygen utilization, demand and delivery type thing. I'm curious to see what that's going to be. The big one for me, I think, is just trying to ascertain what substrates are at play at when. And I think the bigger thing is not really a null hypothesis as such in this one. It's more a look at what things affect overall physiology so we can inform and prescribe. I'm a big believer that I think that biomechanics in boxing is super important. And I think in a lot of ways, I'm leaning to suggest that poor biomechanics is going to lead to poor substrate efficiency and poor recovery during rounds. But there's a lot, we've got a lot to start. We start this in October, so we've still got a lot to lock down. The proposal's written, it's been accepted. The first project is looking at substrate utilization. So it is comparing the different methods that we know exist and then looking at the new models that we want to propose to see whether there's a correlation. Because we know that when we go in the lab and everything's pretty and clean, we're going to see hopefully reproducible results. But when we go into the dirty gym and things are moving around at different speeds, we're not going to see the same thing. It's going to be completely different. So we have to ask ourselves why. Why is that?
How do you make the difference between good and bad biomechanics in boxing?
A good example is extension. So the shoulder has to come out in a jab. The good extension, a lot of times it's short. A lot of times you see overcompensation where people are very heavy over the front legs and they lean heavy over the front leg. So they overextend. And that then creates a bit more energy need to pull back and maintain hip position. You see that quite a lot. In the clinch, you see a lot of people don't maintain good natural posture and high shoulder position. They're leaning over, so they're getting depleted much quicker. And a lot of times as well, it's the simple things like the half step back to evade an attack, to put yourself in a position to counter attack. Sometimes that's often a lot of boxers. And what's more interesting for me is the metrics of hand speed. How does hand speed suddenly differ over later rounds? Because if you take away the research and take away all that good stuff and you think about performance as a whole with a fighter and what you're trying to do, you're obviously in the ideal world want to stop your opponent via knockout. So you need some amount of power to be able to do that. Lightweight boxers don't have as many stoppages as heavyweights. So we don't actually have any heavyweights. All our guys are pretty light. So we're in this world of, can we make them knock people out more? So we're looking at things like that. So there's a lot of things go on in boxing that's really fascinating, that's really not kind of well understood. But at the end of the day, my job as a performance specialist, sports scientist for the Holland Sporting Club is to make them get through 10 rounds at championship level and maintain the mechanics to allow them to be producing effort and sustained effort just as good in those last rounds as the beginning rounds. Because if you don't stop an opponent and you're on a scorecard system, it's a subjective scoring system depending on what the judges like to see. So we're in this position where we're constantly getting our lads to kind of make sure they're busy, they're active in the early rounds, and they look like they're always engaged. And you need a good engine for that. So it's quite interesting, and it's kind of been more interesting using the Moxy because we're getting a lot more data on how someone's actually performing, which is pretty fascinating to me.
Yeah. So let's talk about this. You're talking about essentially the energetics, the underlying energetics informing or giving extra clues to allow you to better interpret the biomechanics that are occurring. Where do you place your Moxies? Let's begin with that. So
we've tried a lot of different placements. In sparring, you don't have the same luxury as doing, say, technical pad work. Technical pad work, you can put them anywhere. In sparring, we're limited pretty much to the lower body. Now, for a long time, we went like Vastus, we went Rec Fem, and we went kind of maybe like on the hamstrings, like bicep femoris or whatever. But when I started reading Lotensky's paper and looking at, they were saying that the main activating muscle was the Rec Fem, and then it was like transverse abdominis, and then it went up the chain. So I was kind of interested in that paper because the one thing they didn't look at was the calf muscle. Now, in boxing, the foot's always more or less plantar flexed, the heel's usually off the ground, and you're pushing in that direction. So it made sense to look at the calf muscle. So we go calf muscle and we go Rec Fem. And we go both sides. So we have four Moxy monitors. And that's been really interesting for us to see how well someone's pushing off the foot and whether they've got that sustained effort in the lower leg. Along with, obviously, there's a slight hip flexion takes place as you extend and throw, and to see whether that's been reflected in the Rec Fem. And those have been the preferred options for us. In an ideal world, you maybe get deltoid, you could do erector spinae, you could do an intercostals. I had a good chat with Evan Pygon about intercostals, which made me think about that'd be nice. But in sparring, it's very difficult. It's hard enough with a heart rate monitor to keep it on in sparring, and to have like, I mean, I'm in a very luxurious position, I'll say this now, to Dean and Billy and those kids, because they let me tape them up, stab them, jab them, take bloods. They're like human guinea pigs, but they've seen the progression themselves and how much quicker, stronger, and faster they've become with the data that they're kind of like converted. So it's been pretty lucky. So I could say to Dean, look, we're going to just do your glutes. And, you'd be like, you wouldn't question that. You'd be like, okay, whatever. But it tends to be gastroc and Rec Fem for us. That's been the one we've consistently used over the last 6 months. So we have a consistent data bank, so we can compare data. So that's been quite important to us. And it's been really, really interesting, because when you start measuring the leg strength of boxers, you start to see that strength and conditioning experts are obsessed with landmine presses for the shoulder. And they're obsessed with doing back squatting. But when you take them into the gym and you do a movement assessment, most of the time they fail single leg work. They just don't have single leg work at all. And boxing's in a split stance. So you're able to show them with the Moxy that, look, this leg's just not functioning the way it should. You're not getting power delivery. You're not getting push throughs. You know, so it's been an eye opener for some S&C coaches. Mm-hmm. Some have responded really well. I would say the majority have not responded.
What's the pushback?
I think people, I don't know whether it's people's job, so they kind of feel that you're criticising what they're doing. So there's a bit of reluctance. Boxing's a very funny sport. You know, there's not a lot of sports scientists working in boxing. And there's not a lot of joined up teams. So you've got like an S&C guy is responsible for this, a nutritionist is responsible for this. But there's nobody marries it up and sits together. Whereas we're completely different. We have a very team-based environment. We sit and go, right, what's the schedule for this week? Who's doing what? Why are they doing this? And we are very open to critique. So we don't want yes people. We want people to ask why we're doing it. But even with some big-name boxers that I was almost involved with lately, it was clear the S&C coach thought he was God, that he was responsible for everything. And I don't think they took quite kindly to the conversations I had with them, where I said, you know, like, some boxers will succeed without good nutrition, S&C, and everything else. And it's important that we don't forget that we are not responsible for everything. It's a team thing. And that didn't go down well. So, because I think some S&C coaches are really on the bandwagon with it. But we had a boxer not that long ago come to us. This came from a really well-renowned S&C coach. And the first thing we always do is a movement assessment. Because before I put them in an S&C program, I want to make sure they get mobility and stability. If they don't have that, we need to work on that. You know, and this kid's been back squatting and doing plyo box jumps and skater jumps poorly, I should add. But he failed 95% of the movement assessment. He couldn't squat properly, he had no stability in his legs, he couldn't, you know, he had no overhand reach. And I was thinking, why are you deadlifting and doing Olympic lifts if you can't even stand on one leg? You know, so that's the first thing we always do, this movement assessment. And it's been fascinating lately. You know, and the S&C coach was like, but he can back squat 2.5 times his body weight. And I'm like, yeah, but what relevance is that to throwing a right hand at velocity while it's moving laterally? Where does it marry up? And so some S&C coaches suddenly get it and go, wait a minute, yeah, this is really interesting. And then you get the option of introducing some nice sports science to them and different ways of thinking. But in boxing, it's still pretty old school. I mean, it's like C-rock, pick up rock, drop rock. No, it's pretty bad out there. I mean, it's getting better, I think. But there's a big pushback against a lot of things.
If you were to give your, like, I don't know, top 5, not even exercises because it's maybe too narrow, but categories of movements that are underutilized by boxers in the gym, or that
definitely single leg work.
Both knee and hip dominant.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm a big believer. I guess I think what Mike Boyle's done all this joint by joint approach, and Gray Cook's done that type of thing. I think there's something to it. I don't fully agree with it, but I've done like the FMS and TPI courses and all that type of thing, and get my own opinion on it. But I think there's definitely something to a joint by joint approach at looking at what needs to be done. So I think push, pull, twist, and single legs. But the biggest thing I find is that a lot of boxers are too overdeveloped in the pecs and the shoulder, and they're not developed enough in the legs. And what goes in the later rounds, and you can see this with the Moxy, where you start to see desaturation, saturation values go all over the place, is that the legs will go first. And if you think that the legs are the foundation, when you're taking punishment to the head and the shoulders and the triceps, you need that lower leg musculature in place to keep you in the game. And there's some kind of interesting stories at our place where you people in and, quite well-known boxers, and you say, can you just do a lunge for me? And that knee's out here and the hips over here, and you kind of think, wow, this is crazy. It's funny because we use a lot of eccentric work. So we use the K-box, we do a lot of eccentric training. I'm a big believer in eccentric training for tendons and ligaments. I think it pays a lot of dividends, and I think it's easy for a boxer to do on the K-box with them overreaching. So we use that. We used to use a lot of velocity training, but we backed away from that. But you get some boxers that just want to hit the gym all the time. They just want to be constantly lifting, throwing things around. And for us, it's a very simple approach. We don't do as much S&C now as we used to do. We're a bit more on quality of movement. I think quality of movement and breathing are probably the two biggest things for our gym, because breathing is an interesting one as well in boxing. It's another area that's not really been looked at, breathing frequency. And when you start to look at it, you see a lot of hyperventilation in the later rounds. It's kind of crazy, really crazy.
I definitely want to come back to that, the breathing part of boxing, which is, I think, like you said, really interesting in boxing, and I think in all sports, and probably overlooked most of the time by most people. Which is I think why it's such an interesting field, is because yes, there is some information, but there's probably not as much as there could be. And so, but again, we'll get into that. Talking still about the Moxy, how do you see that somebody's getting tired? If you have those two rec fems and those two gastrocs, how do you assess someone in the later rounds? I don't know if they're sparring or if they're working on a bag. Is that the same? Do you have to have the sparring data?
So sparring is interesting because you see a lot more on the sparring data than the bags, because the work rate's different, and there's obviously a different stimulus because they've been hit. So there's a massive difference. So normally what we tend to see, a good level boxer that's in good shape, you start to see that initially there's a good desaturation, and then on the rest break you see comes back, it saturates back up quite nice. You get a nice curve. It's a nice linear sharp curve. Later rounds that starts to drop off. You start to see the oxygen's just not been extracted. It's not been utilized, and fatigue starts to set in. You see a massive linear increase in heart rate. A good boxer, you'll see a linear increase in the heart rate, and the THB normally trends with the heart rate really nicely. You'll see it come up, the rest comes down, comes back up, and it goes that way. An unfit boxer is like a jaggy mountain hill that rides everywhere. It's like, and it's kind of interesting because we started putting Billy and Dean on this for their championship. Initially, they would desat and sat back up really nicely, probably up to about round 5. And then after that, it just plateaus. There's just no extraction taking place. The muscle is not taking the oxygen. It's not releasing it. It's just dead.
Is that in the whole lower body? Is that both?
Yeah, you see that. You see that.
And calf?
Yeah, you see it. Yeah, we see it both, which is interesting. You normally tend to see it more on the dominant leg. So if depending whether southpaw or orthodox, you'll see that. And after a lot of single leg training and essential work, we start to see it balance itself out. We start to see both rec fem starting to work pretty much relatively close. Maybe a slight difference, but generally in tandem. And we start to see very nice trends with THB and heart rate. We start to see it kind of a lot better. And in sparring, it's interesting because if you have two of them on the sensors, you can tell who's fatiguing, which is really interesting. Now, another interesting thing that I wasn't doing, that Guglielmo suggested a really good thing, was that he was talking about using the Moxy sensor with gymnasts. and knowing when they had peaked and when they hadn't peaked and when there was still gas in the tank to make them do extra reps.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a conversation with this and I thought it was quite fascinating because I'd never really used it that way. But for the last month in sparring sessions, you know, a boxer can become dejected very, very easily. If they're in an opponent that's maybe outclassed and they get quite dejected. So you start to get a lot, I can't do it, I'm really tired. Can I get pulled out for the rounds? I've had enough from a sparring. Whereas now they have no option because I just go, no, look, there's plenty of gas in the tank, Billy. Let's go. And that has actually been really beneficial for us. It's been a really beneficial learning tool for the boxer also to understand when they're fatiguing and maybe why they're fatiguing and when they can continue on and push through. And that actually for us has been a massive revelation. So Cook did a really good explanation on that. That's been actually, and it's something I should have thought about myself because you think of biofeedback and neurofeedback and things. It makes sense, but it was something we never really considered. So that was, you know, we're getting seeing these kids push through now more. The other interesting thing for them is to let them see their graph, let them see their recovery. Boxers, when they come back, so what happens in a championship round, they'll come back and they'll sit in their stool and they get that covered. But when they spar, they just tend to come back and stand. And one of the things we changed after looking at the Moxy was to try and make things more sport specific. So even in spar sessions, we have them sit because we want to encourage that nice recovery rate in the minute so we can get them nice and relaxed and come back out. And Moxy allowed us to really show them standing positions. So a lot of times we'd say to them, right, come to the end of the ring and they're fidgeting and they're waiting for the bell to go. We were like, no, stay still, nice and relaxed, hunch over a little bit, open the diaphragm, open a little bit free. Look what happens. And they start to see that, you know, they're starting to kind of saturate back up. Everything's looking really good. The heart rate's coming down and everything moves into play. And it's been a really good tool for us. So we kind of use the Moxy purely, I guess, multiple ways. Physiologically, we're using it. We're looking at it to see biomechanics, to see whether the boxer's pushing off the foot right, if they're not. We're also now looking to use it as a psychological tool for training methods and feedback, which is, so I mean, there's a lot you can do with that tiny little device.
Yeah, I think it's
crazy. Understanding what the hell is going on, that's the hard part.
It is. The tool is amazing, and I've said it time and time again. And like you said, there's so many different ways to apply it, but then you have to know what you're looking at, or you have to put in the work to try and understand what's coming out of it. That's the hard part.
I mean, it was difficult for me in the beginning because I had looked at the Portamon years ago, and I just couldn't really justify spending the money to do something that nobody understood. And even just trying to change a boxer's nutrition program was very difficult at times. You know, I had to have them, you know, train high, sleep low, and change around the carbohydrate use. I thought there's no way in hell anyone's going to let me attach sensors to them, you know, because I had wanted to do some muscle biopsies and that was never going to happen. And then I wanted the EMG sensors and that was never going to happen. So the Portamon was out the window, but the Moxy looks more elegant. So when I decided to get the Moxy, I thought this could be a hard push, but it wasn't. It was actually because it looks like a good unit. It looks really nice. You know, it was okay. But when we first started putting it on, you're like, well, what are we seeing? You know, why is this muscle desaturating? This one's not. Why is this one's THB going up? Why is this one? Try to get a handle on it was really, really difficult. And we're about a year into it now, and we're still seeing crazy things at times. And then when you go from sparring to bag work and you put it on intercostals, then you get a completely different picture. So, and then you try to look at breathing frequency and intercostal activation. So it opens up a massive can of worms for anyone that wants to do it. But it's probably one of the best things you can do if you want to get an idea of what your athlete's actually doing, because it is an eye opener. Because people that you think are fit, you realize fall apart pretty fast with it. And people that you think are probably not as fit, sometimes you realize actually they're not too bad. They actually do a lot better. But I think for the PhD is going to be tricky because the aim is to look at rates of fatigue modeling. And the idea is we want to try and get enough data using the Moxy on all of our CPET work. So everything that's getting any cardiopulmonary, we're using the Moxy with it. And then we're going to try and look at, is there ways to kind of compare or correlate substrate use with the, you know, the metabolic device versus without it with the Moxy readings and seeing whether we can put a model. I think we'll get a lot of, well, I can't go any more grayer than I am, but I can probably go more bald than what I am, I think that's going to be it's going to be interesting, really exciting, but I think it's going to be difficult. But I think it's going to allow us an insight that we're not seeing elsewhere. So yeah, I love all this stuff. I love all
When you were talking about the, fighters getting tired in the legs in the later rounds, and you see that in their inability to utilize or inability to recover from an oxygen standpoint, if you look at the lower leg and you see those trends, what does that mean? They need to do more skipping rope. They need to spend more time low intensity on a bag.
It depends. So what we'll do is we'll look at what occurred in the round. We'll look at what kind of punishment would they take in the round, and we'll look at where they maybe throw in a lot of unstructured striking. So maybe they're starting to swing. Because what happens with boxers, they get fatigued and they're conscious they need to still try and win the fight or stop the fight. They start throwing haymakers. And part of the education process is try to explain to them, no, that's not good for your energy use, because you're using more energy and you're leaving yourself much more exposed. So
and you're probably doing things and moving in ways that you haven't trained for. And so you're very, very inefficient doing those too.
Yeah. So that's probably the biggest thing for us, is a lot of times they don't need any more S&C because they're fit, they're lean, they've got their body weight in position, everything's in good. So a lot of times it's those points are learning points. We'll take them back on the pads and we'll just drill it and technically run it, and we'll say, right, bag session specific, keeping this zone, and we'll just put them on the Moxy and we'll say, right, okay, you're peaking, we want you to drop off, relax. Because you want to teach your boxer to be engaged, but know when to break away to get these little moments of recovery and then come back in. And you can do that with the Moxy, because we can say, right, break away and sparring. So we can set sparring up very specific with the Moxy and say, right, you're peaking, we need you to break away. Heart rate's too much elevated, you're not kind of saturating back up, the muscle's not performing the way it should, break away. And we can get them to work strategies of keeping the opponent away, maybe using the jab and just setting up distance. And the other hand, conversely, it's the other way around as well. There's lots of times we can be saying to an opponent, we need you a bit more explosive, because you're very plateaued, nothing's occurring, but you've got plenty of muscle options there. It's readily available in the tank. More explosive work, please, more combinations. Let's piece it together. And that for us has been the way we've been doing it. It's not tended to reflect itself in S&C necessarily, but part of that is because the people we're using it with are pretty good level anyway. I don't tend to use it with amateur boxers. It tends to be pros, and it tends to be quite seasoned pros at the moment. That's just a personal preference thing, I think. I will at some point compare amateurs to professionals with the Moxy. But I think the problem I've got with the Moxy with amateurs is it's only 3-minute rounds, whereas the pros were doing 8, 10s and 12s. So there's a lot more data that we can capture to understand fatigue at later points. But it's a really good tool, but I think you need to use it in conjunction with the knowledge of the biomechanics of what the boxer's doing to get the best out of it.
Yeah, like what's coming to mind when you're saying all this is really the sports science at the service of the sport itself. It's not SNC. It's no. We were looking under the hood to better inform technique, to better inform strategic decisions in the ring, and again, like you said, in training, better feedback to link up with. So the athlete knows, okay, when I feel that way, it means that I'm at that point. And so, like you said, like I need to break away, or I can push. And so at the end, where, like you said, getting to a more holistic approach of coaching, which is not, oh, you do your job on the ring, I do my job in the gym. It's like we all work together towards the same goal, which again, in the end makes a whole lot of sense. It's just a little harder to
it does. I mean, it's when I kind of think about how we've used it, it's been when we use it as much as we can. We will occasionally use it in S&C sessions. I just don't feel that I get much out of it that I don't already know about hypertrophy or what we need to do with protein synthesis and everything else, right? So I know what we need to do to build mass in our athlete if we need it. I know a power phase where I need it, but where I want it is in the performance outcomes. I want to know what are we seeing that's inhibiting or limiting. Because at the end of the day, I think the whole thing for me in the last 5 years has been, we need to find what's limiting performance. We know what makes performance good and the attributes that we want to put in the ingredient mix, but we need to work out what's maybe not working, what's stopping the cake from, coming out the oven kind of the way it should. And that's probably been the biggest change for me, has been going away from let's make you bigger, to a case of, well, what's stopping you from performing? And that's a rabbit hole in itself, from psychology to physiology to nutrition to everything else. But that process bonds you more with your athlete as well, because they suddenly realize you're actually really interested in them as an individual. And one of the great things about doing this type of training with them with the Moxy and with kind of metabolic mass and things and devices, is they know it's a very individualistic thing for them. And they know they're not competing with somebody else in the gym, because you can't do it because it's apples and oranges. So they know they're getting time, and that time is really specific to their goals. And I think it's created a much better relationship with athletes, because athletes come in, even in so basically I have my day-to-day business, which is my Evolve Performance stuff. And I work from everyone from like stay-at-home mums and dads to elite athletes. And we do the same thing. We do with the pro boxers and pro boxers, but it's the same process. You need to get to know them, and I understand what they're looking to achieve, what could be limiting that success, and then putting something into play for them. And it's a crap business model, because you're not churning out, you're not generic templates, and we don't do any of that stuff. So it means you have less athletes, but the quality at the end, I think, is much better. And I think for me, at this point in my life, I'm really more interested in the journey of an athlete. I'm not so fussed about the winning part. I've had a chance to work with like athletes that are already world level, but it's not as exciting taking a youngster and helping develop them and educate them and see them how to come out the other side. And I like that. And I like that about the type of work we do with the sports science. I don't do as much S&C as I used to do, because I find this much more fascinating. Why is this occurring? Why is this, And I think the more we understand about rate limitations, the more we can make performance much more efficient, and we can make kids much more successful. It pains when you go into a gym and all they're interested in is doing wall ball throws. There's no attempt to understand, why is this kid not performing to their potential? And you say to coaches, why is it not? I don't know. It's just not good enough. And you're like, no, it could be respiratory, it could be cardiovascular, might need some cardiac output training, and we've had phenomenal results. We athletes at a high level and clinical patients, and the other spectrum of it, because my wife was a doctor, and we've taken patients in a much more sport specific route and said to them, right, you need to go for surgery, you need to lose some weight, or maybe your resting heart rate's not good enough. And using very similar protocols, we've managed to see patients reduce their weight pretty effectively, decrease heart rate, and allow them to get operations that they couldn't normally have. So there's two flip sides. I think one of the things I'm very keen on sports science is, I think if it's done right, it can cross-transfer a lot of the knowledge into general pops, and general pops can get the benefit without the suffering of biopsies, the athletes and everything else, and it can inform. And I think that's a good thing as a whole. But I still think, especially in some sports like boxing, there is a pushback against it. I think, however, UFC, MMA guys are a lot more open to sports science, and probably conventionally boxing still is at this point in time, for whatever reason.
I want to come back on your statement about sports science and health. What came to mind was Inigo San Milan. You probably
Yes.
know the
Yeah.
guy. And how he works with world-class cyclists, and also does research in the field of cancer and diabetes, and you look at that like you said, the link between the two. For him, it's all about the mitochondria. This is where things happen. This is also where things go wrong. If we can understand it, if we can understand what he says is, if you can understand what a good mitochondria looks like, then you probably know what you need to tend towards or trend towards with someone who's in bad health, in order to get their body functioning better. Yeah,
he had a great podcast on lactate, really, and I remember reading some of his work years ago, which for a long time we probably didn't do zone 2 training as much as we do now. Now we do a lot of zone, even with fit, healthy boxers, because we want that kind of mitochondrial kind of density. We want that powerhouse in place. And it's hard to say to a boxer, I need you just on the treadmill for an hour at, zone 2, like 120 beats per minute. And they go, but suddenly you start to see that the endurance in the later rounds is there. And I think that is coming from the fact that we do way more zone 2 based work than we've ever done before. And I was never a massive lactate lover until I started to listen to a lot of his work, and starting to see the benefit of understanding it is kind of, obviously, it's a transporter, cellular transporter, and kind of as a fuel source, and is using it as a marker to indicate when they were in that kind of zone 2 zone. And we've been using that quite a lot lately with really, really interesting results.
Can you talk a little bit about the kind of results you've been getting, or how you've been applying it?
So with patients, interesting. So years and years ago, we were interested in heart rate variability. So that was a big thing for us. And at the time, Joel Jamieson was doing heart rate variability. And we were probably one of the few people in the UK at our old medical surgery that were we had an ECG machine and we had Cubase software, and we were taking ECGs and we're trying to find the link. And a lot of conversations with Joel about it. And the reason I was interested in it is I wanted to see kind of physiological load, because we had a lot of patients that had crazy resting heart rates, like 115, 116, 120. And I wanted to find a way that we could do something that was non-invasive, that would be very easy for them to get that resting heart rate back down, right? Because there's some good clinical indicators, like under 70 is a good resting heart rate. And I spoke a lot with Joel about his training methods, and we put into place a lot of zone 2 base style work. So we had them walking on a heart and polar, sponsored us for a little bit and gave some heart rate monitors for some patients and stuff. So it was really, really good. And we just created a group of walkers, and we seen after about 8 weeks, we could see people that were having maybe 130 resting heart rate drop down to 90. And then we start to see a few more weeks, to drop down to 70. And we've seen a massive turnaround on that. It was massive. And the sad part about it was we had all this great results, and we then applied to the Highlands NHS to do a pilot, and there was no money in the budget to do a clinical trial on it. Otherwise, we could have done a really nice pilot study on it. Mm. But it's something I've always carried forward. So even we've got some runners privately, they've got a lot of like psoriasis, or they get arthritis, got a lot of kind of autoimmune conditions. So we will keep a real firm check on their heart rate variability, and we'll check on their resting heart rate. And probably in the last 3 years, resting heart rate is more important to me than heart rate variability. I think a good resting heart rate is a good indicator of clinical ability and position. So if anyone has a slightly elevated heart rate, we put them in a cardiac output session. So we just go 4 weeks, zone 2, 4 times a week, give me an hour to an hour and a half. And we just see massive differences in kind of reductions in heart rate. And we see endurance at the other end starts to get much more efficient as well.
And
which in turn you start to see it,
It was, you were probably going there. Do you then see that translated in health markers going up, even if it's subjective markers of how they feel, of how they perform on a day-to-day basis? Yeah,
you see it in the blood results as well, because you see the kind of CPR kind of inflammation marker go down. You start to see that in the ESR results. You can see kind of a lot of other kind of interesting markers. We've had patients that, the liver function test was a bit just a borderline. We've seen that improve as well with it. And I think what happens as well is that for a lot of patients, they're inactive because they can't exercise. And they go and see like a health consultant who tells them they need to be on the treadmill, like thinking they're like Usain Bolt and kind of running like crazy. Or they go on a program that's too far reaching. And I think it sets them back. So our approach was completely different. We went, no, we'll create a walking group.
That's all you need. That's all you need. If you got to shape, you don't need to run. You need to walk.
Right. So, and then we'll just make it difficult one day. We'll go up the hill one day and we'll just change the route. So we did it like covertly, and we fostered a nice community of patients. And then one day we thought, let's do a wee recipe club. Let's get them bringing in recipes. And then I got some local farmers to donate produce, and then we did cooking sessions with them. And I think just the whole catalyst, because it wasn't pushed hard and it was very just matter of fact, we went for a walk. And people couldn't believe that they were walking 4 times a week, 5 times a week, and suddenly the resting heart rate, the blood pressure was coming down. And the diabetic nurse was like, she was excited. The practice nurse was excited. And I think that was a really good way of doing it. I was really gutted that the NHS didn't want to run with it and do an exercise and prescription protocol, because I think that was it. But we've done the same with athletes that maybe have had coming back from injury, and you say, we need you to do this cardiac output, as Joel James would call it, zone 2 training. And they're very resistant at first, because it doesn't feel like they're doing anything. But once they see the benefits, it's amazing, and we still have all our, Billy and Dean, even they're 3 weeks out of title fight, they will still be doing cardiac output training 2 times a week. So, and we just change it. So we just say, right, so Saturday, rather than being inactive, just take your girlfriend and go for a hike, just got one of the nice Monroes or something, but try and maintain this heart rate zone. And we'll just maybe set up a Garmin watch so it just vibrates subtly, so they know, right, I'm going to be pushing too hard here, just bring it back. And it's crazy, because you think about it, it's not an intense zone. It's intense enough for a lot of people, but it's not too intense. And you get all that kind of mitochondrial biogenesis, you get all that really lovely cellular biology work, which is building that foundation wider and stronger, and everything else is coming into play. And, and when I listen to some of the podcasts, and the conversation I had, I thought, we need to do a bit more of this. So it's probably that, and probably using the Moxy as a feedback system being the two best bangs for buck in a lot of ways. The low investment, they're not strenuous or difficult things to do, and you get a massive buy-in with the clients and patients as well. So
yeah, the zone 2 remains, it almost sounds too good to be true, right? You
I
just
know.
need to spend the time, you just need to put in the hours, and you just need to respect that bracket, and good things will happen.
It is hard for athletes though, because I was doing a lot of ultra running at the beginning of the year, and I had a really bad ACL pull, and I've kind of went off and I've porked up a little bit, so maybe more extra weight. And I've kind of went back to try to do the zone 2 because my rest and heart rate's up. There is, I think, if you're an athlete and you're used to going high intensity all the time, there's something very difficult in your spirit that says you're going to walk for an hour on a treadmill or going to go outside for a walk. I think it's really, really hard to put the brakes on.
Mm-hmm.
But we've had good, I mean, I've had really good results for runners doing like 80% low intensity work, 20% high intensity work. It's the same idea. I mean, it's just the same principle. You put them in a much lower zone. But there is something, I think, psychologically destroying. Like if you go from having an 18-minute, 12-second 5K, and then you're asked to walk really slow in zone 2, and you're not even getting to your 5K maybe because you're so slow. There is psychological things, I think, with athletes. But I think combat sports, especially boxing, is very high intensity based. I think there's been a massive issue, I believe anyway, with this red zone training methodology that's been touted left, right, and center. That
can you talk about it for those who don't know?
Yeah, so red zone is just basically, if you think of zone 5 and your heart rate, if you look at any of these the kind of heart rate monitor charts, zone 5 is the ultimate maximum heart rate zone. You're going into the upper end. And there's been a big push to have people work that zone as intensely as possible. And I think there's benefits in high intensity training if it's done right. But there's been a propensity with boxers to spend all their life in that zone, right? Back session, running. So what happens, kind of interestingly, is we took a couple of boxers, is they step in the ring and they automatically start to get heart rate elevation, cortisol rise, adrenaline kicks in, and they naturally put themselves in a really heightened state because that's all they ever do is put themselves in a heightened state. So we've kind of backed away from a lot of that and said, no, we have specific red zone days, if you want to call it that. We've got another name for it, but we won't mention it. And then the rest of it, we want a nice balance, because too much of a good thing is a bad thing. But in the world of boxing, we've been obsessed with red zone. Everything's red zone, red zone, red zone, red zone, red zone. You know, your kids doing 10 rounds in the bag and they're dying, and they kind of wonder why the following day they're going to sparring and they're not firing as well as they should, and they're even dejected, and it's like a vicious circle. Whereas we kind of don't do that. We will do red zone days, and those are pretty awful days because they're super maximal. But most of the time we don't do that. Most of the time we're a bit more balanced. We're like, for us is a lot more, we want you to reach a heart rate zone and we want you to recover as quick as possible back down. So we're doing a lot of that type of tempo training for us. But red zoning, I think, is the scourge of boxing. And there's been a lot of companies made a lot of good money on red zone templates.
For the zone 2, you talked about, treadmill for your boxers. Is there any room? I'm trying to think, more specific. Is there like shadow boxing that could be done?
Yeah, you can do shadow boxing
extensively, and that could have those benefits as well.
Yeah, so shadow boxing we use quite a lot for zone 2. Some of them like to use like the watt bike and just low impact as much as possible. Especially we've kind of got an injured athlete just now, and we're kind of just doing that just to keep things ticking over. So that shadow boxing is pretty good as long as So shadow boxing is a funny one for me. I think shadow boxing can be a phenomenal workout if it's done right. It can be a really super good workout. But it can also be a really good technical workout if the boxer is in tune with what they're doing. So in a zone 2, I like them to be thinking much more quality of movement rather than quantity of movement. And I think you get a lot much better bang for your buck on that. A lot of time I see shadow boxing just being thrown around just because it's shadow boxing, and people have lost the importance of it, because you can do really good things with shadow boxing, and if a boxer is very cognizant and they can understand their position, their weight distribution, where the shoulder is in relation to their extension point, they can get a lot out of it. But a lot of times I see it really used for really shitty ways. Another big pet hate, and I'll get this out here because everybody hates me for this, is shadow boxing with dumbbells. That's one of the most stupid things you can do. So that drives me bananas.
Why is that stupid, Andrew?
Well, think about it, right? Think about it. You take a 5 kilo dumbbell in each hand, and you basically, what happens is you fatigue, you start to shorten the technique. So it creates a really bad habit. The other thing is when the arm goes out as a lever and it's got a weight in the end, it will pull down. So suddenly the trajectory point changes position. Now, if you're in a spar situation, you're sparring and you change your shoulder position by a few degrees, the angle of attack changes quite dramatically. It's the difference between scoring and not scoring. So one of the things I've been very anti for a lot of years is heavy dumbbell shadowboxing. You see it shortening down and people get very hunched. They don't extend all the way out. The distance changes. And I don't know why there's still this fascination why we're doing exercises that could increase the propensity for injury versus doing shadow boxing in nice quality, where you can build speed or use maybe some light bands and getting kind of a wee bit of eccentric work and a wee bit of kind of acceleration and deceleration and control. But shadow boxing with dumbbells, that's a killer for me. We don't, when I went to David's gym, that's the first thing I said to him was, the only rule with me being here is there is no shadow boxing with dumbbells. To which he said, what about egg weights? I can understand from a point of view of grip strength, okay? And grip strength is another funny one because there's obviously a lot of boxing coaches put a lot of emphasis on grip strength. But if you actually think about when you put wraps on, professional wraps, and your hand goes in, there's not a lot of really tight gripping takes place. Grip strength should occur at the end of the motion as the hand snaps and locks into place. That's what it should occur. So we shouldn't be doing crazy gripping holder things for life or death when it's not sport specific. So yeah, but it's funny. I was in the British Boxing Board of Control going for my trainer's license, and on day 2 they've got like a sports science session, and there's quite a lot of quite well-known coaches there. And Kevin, the trainer, said to me, "You don't like shadow boxing with dumbbells?" And I went, "Oh God, here we go." And it was like
on the spot.
It was like all these coaches stared at me, and it was like, "Well, why?" And I was like, "Well, but they don't see it. It's just something that they were taught, that their coach did, that their coach did, that their coach did." And you get the whole thing, but but this boxer does it or that boxer does it, and I'm like, well, it doesn't matter if that boxer does it or not. It's just not a good thing to give a young boxer to shorten up movement and technique. We shouldn't do it. We should encourage, much more. I think in boxing, we encourage a lot more technical work and less balls to the walls, all out, slappy, flappy hitting bags for the sake of hitting bags. I think in the world of boxing, it's a bad thing. Bag work, too much bag work's bad as well, I think.
Quasi-specific work where you think it looks specific because it somewhat resembles the motion, but
yeah,
and it's changing so many things that it's so far off the mark.
I think there's a lot of things in boxing. It's got a lot of inherent risks. So there's a high risk factor. There are deaths. I mean, we had a kid a few years back, Mike Towell in Dundee, down from here, died in the ring. So it does happen. So my whole thing is well, we need to mitigate this as much as possible. So hitting a bag is not the same as hitting an opponent who's hitting you back. So bags should be used for what? Cardiovascular function, power work. Focus pads should be for timing and distance. And sparring should be for finessing and get as close sport specifically as possible. Now, one of the reasons I was so keen to work with David is they don't do sparring every single day of the week. Sparring is very systematically thought out because it has a chance of risk. So even during the camp, sparring is mitigated as much as possible, and they do a lot of body sparring, so there's no head contact because you can develop a lot of similar attributes. And I think that's the way forward in sports where you can get pretty banged up pretty easily and your life can be changed forever. And I think this is my big issue with other coaches, that is I don't want to be responsible for a boxer dying in the ring. And I don't want to be responsible for their life being dramatically changed. So I want to do the most I can do to mitigate those risks. And the only way I can see we can do it is through research. And obviously there's a love-hate relationship with research because doesn't always bear fruit as much as you'd like it to do. But we need to start somewhere in the education process. And we need research, and we need to have applied science, and we need to merge the two together to find better ways of doing things, I think. And that's why nobody likes me, Sean. That's why I'm quite marmitey in the boxing community. It's kind of like, if you want sports science, all that good stuff, go see Andrew. If you don't want to listen to his crap, maybe go and see someone else. I'm quite marmitey in the world of boxing science, I guess.
At least you have an opinion, an informed one at that, and people can do whatever they want with it.
I mean, I think we're in highly exciting times. It's funny because someone said to me the other day, they said, your review paper and going through all the research, it must be pretty depressing. And I was like, no, it's actually the opposite, because it would be more depressing to me if we had found most of the things I was interested in, because then it would be nothing really for me to look at. But it's actually shown me that there's so much more that we need to be researching. And that's pretty exciting. And like Moxy developing their new app, and a lot of other companies offer much more affordable technology, I think it's really super exciting. I think the problem with that, on the other hand, is you have a flood of equipment and a lot of people giving results that don't really understand the result they're given. So I think it's like a double-edged sword to an extent. But the more cheaper good tech becomes, the more things we can do. And I think that only benefits sports as a whole. And I think if you look at Moxy, I think Moxy is one of the best examples of it going in the right direction. You've got people doing it with CrossFitters, you've got people doing it with endurance cyclists and runners, you've got boxers, kickboxers. There's a whole melting point of massive information coming out, and you can tie it all together. And I think it's, you know, the Moxy Summit, there's so many exciting things. You know, I've learned more probably from the Moxy community in the last 18 months than I have in my whole research master's degree. And that's being brutally honest.
That's a big statement.
It's true though, my whole research degree, I've not learned a single thing other than how to do research and be good at manipulating statistics if I have to manipulate statistics. Not that I'm doing that for my 2 research projects. So that's my supervisor just now. But it's not been the same. And I think this is because at university level, undergraduate sports science, you get taught specific things, you know, alactic, lactic, the conventional kind of energetics model, and you get taught, you know, sort of resting lactate 0.7 to 1 and all that stuff. And then you do masters, they kind of say, well, you know, all that stuff you learned and spent, you know, £100,000 on, it's all nonsense. We're going to teach you the real stuff now. And then you realise they're not really teaching you anymore, other than, you know, how to change the increments in the treadmill to get a better, you know, RER score or whatever. And so it's funny, but I think, you know, like Moxy, on the other hand, you've got a community of people that are already a mix of levels. You've got some people that are S&C coaches. You've got people that maybe work with elite athletes. You get a massive mix. And I think this is when it gets interesting. You start to see what people are doing, how they're interpreting it. You know, is it a Venus occlusion? Is it not? Is it this? Is that? And I think that's exciting because I think that's what takes sports to another level. And I think the way Roger's done the Moxy setup and people like yourself with the podcast, it's been kind of fascinating. You know, Evan's course, it's a really, really deep course if you want to do it.
Yeah, guys and gals, go check out Evan's course. A little plug for that.
Yeah, it's really good. Then you've got Goog doing all his stuff with the Italian boxers and some of his stuff. It's a massive, I think it's a cracking mix of people involved in it. And I think it's really, really exciting. And I think it doesn't matter what the sport is, that's it. And I think if we more tech, like wireless EMG sensors, somebody churns them out next, that'll be my next shopping list point. Because I think, you know, I mean, for me, boxing has always suffered from the fact that you can't measure much in sparring other than lactate and heart rate. You could take some bloods, I guess, in between rounds. I don't think the boxers would be particularly keen on it. But Moxy is one of the few things you can strap on and you can see what's actually happening here. And an actual, as close as you can get to competition. You know, we've been very lucky that we've had other boxers at super high level and for sparring that there's been no objections. So we've never had a coach, even a high level, championship level sparring, say to me, I'd rather your lad didn't have those on. Which is good because a lot of times I'll say, do you want your kid to have it on? And we'll kind of introduce it to them and they're like, well, what the hell is this?
Yeah. Well, so, and I mean, another tool you've been talking about this during this time here is on the metabolic analysis side. So getting gas exchange, or at least at very least getting some ventilation data, seeing how somebody breathes, the importance of breathing in boxing. So let's maybe do a breathing 101 for boxing. Why is it important?
Well, if you think about it, there's a lot of restrictions to breathing because you got a gum shield. So part of the mouth is kind of blocked off. So you tend to find a lot of nasal breathing occurs. So they don't take in as much oxygen as they need. So if you think about the whole circulatory system, you think about you need oxygen to come in, you know, to the system. So what you tend to see is a lot of boxers aren't breathing the way they should. And a lot of it is that natural feeling of restriction in the mouth. So they start to open wider on the mouth and they start to try and suck in too much air, and you start to see massive changes in breathing. So suddenly they've got a massive influx of air, and other times they've got a very restricted. At other times, as the fatigue, they start to lean forward, and you start to see the diaphragm gets closed over, and you're still not getting in. So part of the thing is you want them to do is to be able to breathe, because breathing not only obviously helps circulation and getting oxygen in, but from a physiological and psychological point of view, effort feels slightly less if they're breathing. You know, as soon as you start to hyperventilate and really struggle with the breathing, you start to see a laboured approach. Psychologically, they start to feel tired as well. So we've started adapting a process of trying to get them to regulate and feel their breathing, to try to analyse when in the rounds they feel like they're struggling, and to back away and create space to get the breathing back under control. And we've demonstrated it to them via pad sessions, bag sessions with intercostal muscles, along with, we've looked at like the Zephyr bioharness, because that gives you breathing frequency, ECG, and a few other nice tools in it. And we just try and get them to understand that if they're doing 55 breaths a minute, something's not too good. So they need to kind of calm that down a little bit. So what we normally do with them is we like to sit them down and when we're doing the metabolic test, and sit and go, right, okay, so you're doing 12, 13 breaths per minute, your normal rate. And when you're in your boxing session, you're peaking up to 45, 50, or whatever the number is. We try and bring that down. And we'll just do it through I haven't done a lot of breathing specific drilling with them, other than more, because I'm kind of trying to work out what would be the best exercises to do to encourage better breathing and posture that we can translate into the ring when they're being punched in the face. It's kind of hard. So we're kind of trying to make it much more a conscious process of feeling when they're laboured, and then explain it between rounds. But I think it's probably, as far as I'm aware, there's no research on it in boxing at all, on breathing frequency. There's no research on rest and recovery rates and how breathing affects that. That's been the biggest, probably for us, the biggest change in a lot of ways is getting them to relax their breathing in the recovery minute. Because a lot of times, I was saying earlier, they come in and they're quite, they're heightened state, and you just want them to just totally relax and shallow breathe and just bring the breathing down, get the heart rate down, so when they start a bit more fresh. That's probably been one of the biggest ones for us.
Yeah, you said shallow breathing in the minute rest.
Yeah, just relax, just get everyone calm down.
Is there a place for some, not hyperventilation, but just some good breaths in order to get whatever CO2 is in there out before you start your shallow breathing after a hard effort?
Yeah, definitely. It's the problem we have with that is, and we've tried to try a lot of different methods, is that's fine in controlled environments. If you've got even an infield, so say we've got two of our lads that spar regularly, that's okay. You can get that. You can get a nice exhalation, get CO2 out, and then go through into some breathing pattern. But when they're actually in a competitive spar and it's maybe not going the way they want it to go, or you're in a different gym, like we went down to Manchester for sparring at a gym there, and the temperature in that gym was insane. Like 13 degrees in Aberdeen is like the tropics. But when we went down there, in that particular gym, they had the heating on 24/7. We walked in and it was like Barbados. It was like, what? So, and it was kind of ironic, right? Because we've done all this breathing work with Billy beforehand. A few weeks being like, relax your breathing, because he was getting conscious that maybe he wasn't breathing right. So we done all this breathing work, exhalation, sharp exhalation, get CO2 out, get nice kind of shallow breathing, get everything on. And it just went right out the window. Because suddenly we're in an environment where the temperature was so high, heart rate was elevating at crazy rates, lactate was through the roof, and he just was really struggling to breathe. And it was a hard job to get him to relax. It took a while, a few rounds, to get him to acclimatize and say, okay, we're going to have to find a method that works here for you. And the method for him was just basically dog panting almost. It just was just try to kind of get air in and just relax. And that's kind of what worked. But it kind of made me realize, again, you're down to kind of the environment that you're in. And that's one of the things I'm going to do in the PhD now is have a look at environmental factors. But I think it's an area that I need to delve a lot more into. It's just finding the time to spend getting right into kind of breathing methods and what would work and what wouldn't work. But the other thing as well is, in competition they have ice. So in sparring, you very seldom ever use ice. Now I've spoken to some people that are well more up on environmental physiology than I am, but you're not going to change much in a minute with ice.
It's almost more of a psychological thing.
It is. Yeah. So what we are going to be looking at is, if an athlete has a preference for ice on their wrist or their foot, their ankle, and psychologically it changes the rate of perceived exertion, it would be better to do that. It will look crazy on television because it'll be like, what are these people doing? But if it gives the boxer psychological, almost like a biofeedback loop whereby they start to feel more relaxed, then it's worth looking at. Because I think in turn that may affect respiration as well. We may see changes in breathing frequency via that approach. But yeah, it's just, there's so much to try and to look at. And then you're also looking at, does it actually have a performance effect? Or are you just doing things because you should be looking at it? One of my supervisors said that to me: just because you think you've got a good idea doesn't mean it's going to actually be a good idea. And that's something that's always kind of stood with me. And I think that's pretty spot on.
Which is, yeah, it's true. You can always look for things to optimize, but then at the end of the day, as the English might say, does it make the boat move faster? You have to make sure it translates to the field of play or to the ring or to the sport, because otherwise you're just, as Keir would say, you're shuffling chairs on the Titanic deck.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because, when I started getting involved in performance 10 years ago, we'd throw the kitchen sink at everything. Strap this on, strap that up, neurofeedback devices, EEG leads, and then now it's like, no, we'll just do a couple of Moxys and you're Moxy's the heart rate monitor, and we're good to go. Blood lactates occasionally, blood glucose levels occasionally. Playing around with the idea, I'm trialing, the wife's trialing some continuous glucose monitors at the moment to see whether that's going to yield any benefit. I kind of, at the moment, no feelings either way on it. I would be curious to see whether it would be beneficial for a boxer that's in a weight cut phase, in the early stages of a weight cut phase, whether it would be any benefits to that. I'm not too sure. But we're kind of keen to look at things, but very, very few of it actually goes into actual application. And we've tried, I think, every gizmo under the planet, and a lot of the gizmos we end up sending back because they just don't work. Or we spoke about this the other day. There's some tech out there that's absolutely phenomenal with endurance athletes because it's been geared up for endurance athletes, but it's not properly marketed that it's been geared up for endurance athletes. And then when you put it in a boxer, you just see that it just fails. It doesn't do what it's meant to do. It doesn't pick up what it's meant to pick up. And it's not because the product doesn't work. It's just because it was all calibrated and tested in the lab specifically for a demographic that they were kind of interested in. And then troublesome people like me go, wait a minute, that doesn't work. And then the S&C department and the sports scientists start pulling their hair out because, oh God, I've got this guy. He's kind of moaning that it doesn't do what it does. And he's got a lab, so he's been testing the lab against a metabolic device. And and it's kind of funny. And I've had this a few times with companies, and either they're super responsive to it and they change their algorithm, or they're just like, we'll just give you a refund. And just kind of which happens more than not. But I mean, that's the problem, I guess, as well. It's we learned this with the Moxy pretty quick, that person A and person B are two different people. You can't always do the same thing on both of them. The best you can ever hope for is a baseline. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing we've taken away in the last few years. Everyone's about creating a baseline and building from the baseline. That way we don't have this, he can do this and she can do that. Because it's not like that. But a lot of other places, a lot of the coaching methods are still very like that. This person can hit a VO2 of 55. Oh, you're only 47. You're off the pace. Which just kind of happens quite a lot. Whereas we're not like that. Now every boxer has their own metabolic profile that's unique to them. And we're just looking to tweak that metabolic profile to get a bit more 20% good stuff out of them. But we don't compare them to anyone else. It's kind of unfair.
Yeah, talking about the metabolic profile, substrate utilization. You talked earlier about using fats, using carbs. So how does that come into play in an intermittent sport like boxing, and why might it be interesting to measure those things?
So conventionally, the research has shown that initially, the early days of boxing was predominantly anaerobic. And then there was a kind of shift. Davis did a paper and he used a COSMED, and he showed that actually it was the opposite. And interestingly, he just inverted the figure, so it became 80-20 the other way. And I was a big believer that boxing was probably more aerobic than anaerobic. But I think my own studies through, we've put obviously the metabolic mask on the portable device, and we've done pad sessions. We've replicated heavy pad sessions, making the athlete bounce around the ring and clinch positions. And we're seeing that's probably a much more even split between fats and carbohydrates. later rounds, you start to see a lot more carbohydrate utilization than fat, but in those early first 4 rounds, it's pretty close. And it kind of interests me because when you're going through, like, say, if we use Billy as an example at the moment, so Billy's only 1.7 kilos out, or whatever he is this morning. So at this stage, because he's been in a weight cut phase, he's probably starting to break down some muscle protein. He's probably much more on a fat oxidation kind of setup than what he is. But for the sport, we need to make sure he can utilize carbohydrates as well as he can utilize fat, because so there's high explosive moments to that kind of creatine, kind of phosphate and stuff. So my idea is to try and get a better understanding of how an interplay takes place, so that we can kind of fuel on the day a lot more efficiently. And we can also, because for a long, long time we thought about, should we be maximizing fat utilization in earlier rounds when there's less activity? But it doesn't pan out that way. That would only pan out particularly well if your opponent let you utilize fat oxidation by being in a very low intensity zone. It doesn't work that way. So what's more interesting to me is just, what is the interplay? Because it's not, because we know it's a mixture of both. It's not one or the other. They're all firing off at different rates. We just want to start looking at what is the rate of use, and is there, what's more interesting is does biomechanics dictate and change in intensity to the point whereby you start becoming solely dependent on carbohydrates, or is there a more interesting kind of mix of fuel at play? And we really want to look at it more from the point of view of fueling strategies and training strategies, because you get boxers that are either predominantly carbohydrate on everything they do. So you test them on a VO2 test, you test them at rest and metabolic rates. RMR test, they're still super high carbohydrate use. And you got other boxers that are pretty much run all the time, easy zones, out of camp, come into camp, predominantly fat oxidizing, but have major problems utilizing carbohydrates as it gets near fight day. So we kind of want to start to understand, why is that? You know, what makes one person do this? What makes another person do that? And is there much better ways of fueling strategies? And that way we can also look at things. The other big thing we want to look at is, how does rest and metabolic rate change during camp? What's the effect of long-term weight cutting over a period of years? So we're going to do a longitudinal study on that one. Maybe look at 3 or 5 years and just see what happens to someone regularly cutting weight. Is there an effect to metabolism? Does it affect metabolism? And if it does, to what extent? And the other one is inflammation markers. How does consistent inflammation process affect metabolic substrate use? Does it have an effect? Does it inhibit, like mTOR? Do we start to see downregulation of protein synthesis? So you got a whole heap of crazy stuff. So it's kind of really split between really high-end, like laboratory cellular biology, and the other one is, well, that's all great, but he still has to go and punch this boy for 8 rounds. So how do we make that much more efficient? And is there a correlation between the two? That's the other thing. You know, somebody said to me, we're trying to make the boxer out of Rocky too, the Russian lad. So it kind of feels a little bit like that. We're interested in making our athletes the best they can be, but also putting them in a position where we know they're in the ring, they're fueled, they're hydrated, and they're in the best position to defend themselves as well. And so it's a kind of fine line, but it's a sport. If you think about how long ago boxing was introduced, you know, it's the first Olympics or something like the 5th Olympics, I remember what one was, but it's been around for a very long time. And yet, if you go on and do research on physiology, you'll be lucky to find 30 research papers. You kind of think it's kind of strange that nobody's really wanted to know what's actually taking place and what the risk factors are. It's really interesting. Whereas you look at running, you look at cycling.
Why do you think there's so little research that has been done so far on those different realms of study in the context of boxing?
I think a lot of other sports are much more money orientated. You know, a kid may struggle to pay £50 for a reasonable pair of boxing gloves, but usually a good recreational weekend cyclist, and I say this as one of them myself, can go and buy like a £3,000 carbon fiber bike. You know, there's a massive disparity between the two of them. So I think that's part of the problem. And I also think that there's just maybe not enough people at PhD level want to spend a life with boxers. It's not a sexy thing to do a PhD on necessarily. It's not. For me, it is, because for me, we could change a lot of things, but I'm at the latter period of my career, so I'm at the end of the runway, so it's easy for me to do it. I think a lot of younger people at PhD that are thinking to move into research and academia are probably wanting to looking at things like cell signaling, you know, mTOR, you know, or S&C style things. I don't think there's maybe enough interest to want to really look at what's taking place in boxing physiology. I think that's probably it. And I also think it's a very polarizing sport. You know, I don't think my wife's medical partners really understand what I do. I think they probably see boxing as still quite a barbaric sport, you know. And it's a funny one because when I do like all the lectures or presentations and things, people still think boxing is super dangerous because people die all the time. But people die in motorsport more than what they do in boxing. You start looking at the statistics, it's very unfortunate when it happens. There is a very visceral content to it. And that's, I think, what makes it look so shocking. But the safeties come on leaps and bounds. But so I think it's a case of, one, there's not enough money in it. Nobody's going to fund it. Nobody's funding me. My PhD is all self-funded. Nobody wants to pay me anything for it, which is fine. Two, I think it's quite polarizing as a sport. And I think, three, from an academic, if you're going to academia, I think it's probably, I'm not sure it would take you. You know, if you went to an employer and said, I just did 3 years of my life with these 5 young lad boxers, how to kind of make them more efficient. I'm not sure. And I think that's probably what it is. And I think I'd like to see that change. But when you look at the research, it's all in amateur boxing. There's very little in professional boxing. And that's probably just because there's a lot more readiness to get access to amateurs. There's a lot more of them for a start. I've just been in a very lucky position that with my experience in combat sports, I've got access to UFC fighters, that I've worked with a whole heap of higher end athletes, which makes this PhD work. Because my wife and I was having this conversation and she was like, oh, you should have done your PhD maybe in your 20s, which I had the opportunity to do a PhD in my 20s and I declined it. And I said to her, the difference would be that if I was 25, it'd be very unlikely I would have access to the athletes that I have now to do this type of PhD. And that to do this type of PhD, you probably need to have been in the sport for a long time and have readily available access to professionals that are prepared to listen to your nonsense and let you do crazy things in order to make it happen. And that was one of the big issues with universities, was that a lot of the universities that were interested were not local to me. So it would have meant taking boxers to labs in London or whatever else. That's just not going to happen. So it was kind of lucky to find Abertay that were quite keen. But we'll see. I think there's a lot more S&C papers coming out for boxing than there is physiological papers. There's a lot more looking at, you know, does the landmine press, or does the shoulder activate a bit more, or things like that, or power generation, which is all kind of interesting to me. But I still don't think it addresses the underlying things that we need to know about training, because the physiology will dictate what we can do in the S&C, whether it's beneficial to put on some muscle mass in the anterior posterior deltoid versus is it better to have rec fem a bit more activity. So I think it's exciting. I think for me it is anyway. I'm just very, very lucky that they listen to me. And they trust me, which is kind of the big surprises me that they trust me actually some of the times. Like tomorrow, for example, we're going up, we'll probably do RMR tests and we'll do body composition, we'll do lactate, we'll do blood glucose, we'll do spirometry, because I just want to make sure 3 weeks out that everything's in place. And then we'll probably subject a couple of them to some sparring sessions with the Moxy, and we'll also do hand speed velocity checks, and we'll probably also, potentially, we'll have to wait and see if it's going to work out. I would like to do some pad evaluation with the metabolic device to have a look at how Billy is now in camp versus how he was when he first came into camp. Because that'll tell me how his body's responding to training and how he's responding to weight cut phase, and whether at this point, you know, because I suspect, and if Billy's listening to this, you're not eating enough, lad. So, you know, and that's it. Because I'm actually, my role in Aberdeen's interest, because I'm responsible for everything from S&C to performance nutrition to sports science to everything. So it's quite a big role. I often think that, I think, wow, I get sucked up into this one. But it's so interconnected. Everything's so interconnected. You need to have a little bit of understanding of all of these things, I think, to get kind of the best results. And most of what we do is all in-house. We have a couple of external S&C coaches, but generally we do everything in-house. And,
can you talk about, I want to finish with a couple things. Can you talk about the presentation you'll be putting together, doing for the upcoming Moxy Summit?
Good question. So I'm probably going to do, I'm thinking it's going to change. Originally, I was going to do off the research I was going to be doing with the university, but that's not going to happen in time. So what I'm probably going to do is on Billy, Stuart and Dean Sutherland, their process of using Moxy in preparation for the IBF and WBO title fights, and how we used it to inform biomechanics and training methods and recovery methods. I think that's probably what I'm going to do. I think it'd be nice. I thought about doing, I'll touch on Substrate because I think Andrew's kind of mentioned that in the table that it's kind of like on Substrate, which kind of is, but I think I want to do maybe a bit more of applied talk, because I think historically the Moxy Summit has a lot of theoretical talks. So I think it'd be kind of nice maybe to shift that a little bit and do a bit more of a, this is how we used it, this is what we've seen, and this is the relationships between it and what the outcome was, and hopefully, touch wood, because Billy and Dean fighting the 31st of July, that they'll come back with the two belts. So that'll be good. So I think that's what I'm going to do at the moment in time. I think it's probably a better presentation than a dry talk on, glycolysis.
I'm with you there, and maybe in line with that, a last question. Although I love glycolysis, it's fascinating.
Yes, it's glycolytic pathway. And yes.
And to build on your last statement, if there are some maybe curious boxing coaches out there, S&C box coaches out there that want to learn more about, all the things that you talked about, and like you said, it might not be fully accepted in some circles or even known at all. In some places, where can people start to learn about all that?
They could find me on my very lonely Instagram page. I'm really terrible at social media, so that's the Andrew Usher. And I think my Facebook. Actually, I think my Facebook and Instagram is Evolve Performance UK, or evolveperformance.co.uk, or even Northern Sporting Club in Aberdeen. So, yeah, kind of not. We're not actually. We're funny. Kind of funny that we, me and David McAllister are very alike. As soon as a television crew presents themselves, one of us is scuttling to go to the toilet or disappear. We're not very good with kind of, even podcast. Oh my God, podcast. We're not very good with kind of things like that. But yeah, I'm on there. So I don't really post a lot. If it is, it'll be boxing related. At this point in time, I think even my wife just thinks all I do is box. She doesn't realise we've actually got business that works with other athletes, like cyclists and triathletes and everything else. But yeah, but that's how you can find me. I'm always open to discussing and chatting about what we're doing. We are going to be putting on, I think probably going to most likely the end of year next year, put together maybe some online courses on how we use things. And, we're starting to see a lot more boxing coaches kind of hit us up to do training camps to try and bring the sports science in. What I'll say about that is that's, some of them think you can go down for a couple of hours and produce magical results. It's not like that. It is quite a detailed process, because you need to see a fighter during a camp and ideally before a camp to get an idea of how they respond to certain training adaptations and everything else. But if anyone, it is really interesting going down the rabbit hole. It's very deep. It's very dark. Bring a torch.
Don't come alone.
Yeah, it's like Donnie. Was it that thing, that movie with the rabbity thing? It's quite a dark, weird place to go at times. But it's kind of, I keep thinking what my supervisor said when he says, conventional kind of models are there to be broken. I think that's very, very true. I think,
sounds like a mission statement.
Yeah, it's kind of, like when you sit with your PhD supervisor and you discussed a few things, and the last university I was debating doing the PhD where they were like, are you trying to tell us you want to go against like Shulman's bioenergetic model? And I was like, no. I was like, no. They're like, because it seems like you want to redesign some conceptual understandings of bioenergetics and cellular biology. I was like, not really. Whereas I think John at Abertay is a bit more, let's see what happens. And that's exciting. And I think it's just I look at other sports and I think all the things that have taken place. Running's a classic one. Loads of people doing gait analysis, bioenergetics, biomechanics. The last two universities I've been at, their 3D motion capture lab has purely been set up for running and measuring biomechanics and gait. And I think about all of that, and I think if we could just take that into some other sports, we could start to get a much bigger understanding of human physiology as a whole, rather than just as segmented little pieces, which is, I think, what we do in sports science a lot of times. We just segment small components and we forget about the whole body and how we piece it all together. And I think the more we can do that, I think the more it translate across to general health, general population, and just general longevity. And I think that's where we should be going with sports science.
Andrew, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
You're welcome.
Talk to you soon.
Yes.